Welcome to the Global Seminar of the Global Columbia Collaboratory. I am Shannon Marquez, Dean for Undergraduate Global Engagement at Columbia University, and I'm so excited that you've joined us today for a conversation about the future of cities. Now, since urbanization is one of the most pressing global challenges facing the world today, it is indeed an honor to have some distinguished experts here with us, stepping into the Global Columbia Collaboratory to have a robust discussion about this important issue. With the disruption caused by the pandemic, the Columbia University Center for Undergraduate Global Engagement, in partnership with Columbia Global Centers and Columbia World Projects, launched the Global Columbia Collaboratory as a virtual exchange initiative to support students around the world. The collaboratory brings students, thought leaders, and educators together, promotes cross-cultural communication, and enhances skills and global competence to allow students to reflect, ideate, and collaborate to empower them to make a difference in the world. Students participate from 23 different countries and are drawn from all three undergraduate schools at Columbia, Columbia College, Engineering, and General Studies, representing over 30 majors. And we also have students participate from dual degree programs with Sciences Po in Paris and Trinity College Dublin. Using smartphones and laptops to access the Global Columbia Collaboratory virtual exchange platform, students form a community of global thinkers and problem solvers. And they participate in themed global seminars featuring international speakers, such as our seminar today, as well as facilitated reflection, ideation, and collaboration activities. Now, as learnings and perspectives are shared across the collaboratory, students are encouraged to collaborate to support the further development of ideas into projects that have the potential to address the most urgent challenges of our time. Students then form project teams and receive funding to tackle specific global issues and topics of interest, and their work is featured in an online gallery. Now, we are thrilled that over 260 participants have actively engaged in the collaboratory since it launched this past summer, including undergraduate students, observers, graduate student assistants, and we currently have a spring cohort in the collaboratory joining us live today from around the world, including a new group of Columbia Engineering Entrepreneurship Design Challenge students who are developing interdisciplinary technology-driven solutions as part of their experience in the collaboratory. Welcome to all of you. We are excited to see the ideas and design concepts that will be generated based on our discussion today. Some of our students will ask questions to our panelists today, and I encourage the global audience to also submit questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Again, I want to welcome everyone to this Global Columbia Collaboratory Seminar, and I want to thank all of our partners and our esteemed panelists. We are so pleased to be working directly with the Columbia Global Centers for these seminars. And at this time, I want to introduce Safwan Masri, Columbia University Executive Vice President for Global Centers and Global Development, who will introduce us to our panelists today. Safwan?
Thank you, Shannon. Greetings and welcome, everyone. It really is my pleasure to introduce today's webinar, the first of our spring term collaboratory series entitled Future of, which addresses our post-pandemic world. Today's topic is the future of cities, rethinking urban sustainability. And with us is a remarkable assemblage of experts to help examine the issues at hand. As has been true of plagues throughout history, cities loom large in the story of this pandemic. We have seen footage of, or perhaps experienced, the cleaning teams in their hazmat suits sweeping through the streets of urban China, the empty piazzas of Rome, the tenants leaning out their windows to cheer and clap for first responders and medical workers in New York City. Most of us live in urban settings, either in one of the few dozen enormous cities spangled across the globe, or in the smaller cities that are home to about half the world's population. Seen from space, urban centers glow, and a web of light spreads over the globe. It might look pretty, but what we are really seeing are hotspots, danger zones. The rapid urbanization of the planet has led to poor air quality, tainted or scarce water supplies, environmental hazards, and the disappearance of many plant and animal species. We are long past the time to argue about the reality of climate change, and we must now embark on viable plans to rebuild in ways that can actually be sustained. It isn't at all clear where our story is going as far as city life is concerned. What is clear, though, is the need for new sustainable practices. Despite the association of urbanization with climate crises, we know that when it comes to structural, economic, and environmental change, cities are definitely the playing field we want to be on. We can pivot towards zero emission vehicles and renewable energy sources. The federal government can cease to allow more drilling for fossil fuels on its lands, and it can work on restoring the health of land and water. But real systemic and lasting change must happen in the places where most of us live, cities. We need to plan for and design green buildings in which to live and work, and develop sustainable transportation infrastructures. But even before commencing with that work, there are engineering challenges presented by island nations, coastal cities, or flood-prone areas. This requires that we become familiar with climate change modeling and plan for the world as it will be, not as it was. You have probably seen the video of the old scenic highway along the Pacific collapsing into the sea, less than a mile from where last summer's fires scorched the earth. Green policies help ameliorate the environmental degradation behind events like these, and also plan for structures that can withstand some of the inevitable hurricanes, droughts, earthquakes, and floods. Against the backdrop of shattered businesses and genuine suffering, the cost associated with adopting sustainable policies and practices might raise concerns, but the price of not meeting this moment is far more devastating. Having been forced during the pandemic to witness tangible proof of our power to impact the environment, we now have the opportunity to begin a new way to govern, design, and plan with the reality of climate change in mind. The recovery ahead of us must not be about trying to return to the world as it once was. We do not want to recover the past. We want to plan for the future by accelerating our progress toward building a more sustainable and equitable society. Now, to help us envision this better and more resilient world, let me introduce our moderator, Amale Andraos, who in turn will introduce today's panelists. Now, in addition to the professional expertise she brings to the subject, Amale is a native of Beirut, a city we both cherish, the ancient and beautiful port city that has certainly shown the world many times over the importance of resilience and recovery. Amale Andraos is the Dean of the Columbia University Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. She is committed to design research, and her writings have focused on climate change and its impact on architecture. Amale is also co-founder of Work AC, a New York-based architectural firm that was recently named the #1 design firm in the United States by Architect Magazine, and has also been recognized as the AIA New York State Firm of the Year. I am fortunate to be able to count Amale as a close friend. Amale, I will turn our webinar over to you.
Thank you so much, Safwan, and thank you, Shannon. This is a very both an exciting and important topic of conversation with a fantastic group of colleagues, scholars, practitioners who are really advancing many of these issues. Time is of the essence in all ways, including today, so I will try to kind of move relatively fast through the questions to make sure we have time for student engagement as well, and I'll introduce the speakers as I'm asking them questions. But in general, I think we understand that COVID is a sort of shock that almost tells us what the shock of climate is already in a very visible and tangible way. So how do we jump from the pandemic to addressing climate change and social and environmental sustainability? And so my first question, I will turn to Kate Orff. Kate is a professor at the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. She leads the urban design program there, where she has really retooled it entirely to address issues of water and water urbanism in particular. She is also a co-principal or principal of Scape, one of the most pioneering landscape architecture firms, not only in the US, but in the world. And so my first question, Kate, is really, a lot has been said about how COVID has, transformed cities and people leaving cities, and we know that cities are going to be essential to addressing climate change. In particular, what Safwan mentioned, the issue of density. And so I wanted to turn to you to try to understand COVID's impact on cities as we engage with this question of addressing climate change.
Thank you. Very nice to be here, and hi, all fellow panelists. Well, first of all, I do feel like in the immediate aftermath of learning about COVID and how the virus is transmitted, one of the primary sort of responses was the 6 foot in physical distance, and then later, of course, even we had the masks. So I actually felt like at the outset that that was a little bit of a red herring, in the sense that there was an immediate translation of the 6 foot into drawing 6 foot circles around everyone, and then instead of sort of looking more at systematic issues like access to healthcare, wealth and equity and disparity in our health systems, disparity in choices relative to what is available to wealthy people who can sort of move out of the city immediately into a second home, like the better choices that are available to people with significant resources. So I do feel like the immediate sort of response that cities are dense and need to become less dense is a red herring, and that we know more now, and we can think very differently about the situation. Density, of course, Safwan mentioned in his remarks about the collapse of biological species. We're in the midst of an ecocide across the planet, and density is one of the truest and most direct ways of preserving parts of the planet to ensure the existence of non-human species. So I think in general, density is only one sort of minor factor in the bigger equation. You look at cities like Manila or Seoul, Korea, that are incredibly dense, but that have not had that same sort of impact of the virus. So we do need to look more broadly. And I guess to other factors, wealth, et cetera. But just to pivot briefly to urban nature, which is really my love and my subject, I was reflecting the other day about that the relationship of nature in cities has always had a strong relationship to pandemics and public health. Even in the 1860s, Frederick Law Olmsted, who is the designer of Central Park and Prospect Park, was also part of the United States Sanitation Commission. One of the primary drivers for his park in Boston, the Emerald Necklace, was to address water and sanitation, typhoid, and cholera, et cetera. So I do feel like there is truly an exciting landscape-based response to COVID that could both, address some of the public health issues and some of the equity issues that have been exacerbated in this time, by imagining and advancing, connective, open, more transformative landscapes that provide means of transportation, non-motorized transportation that connect segregated neighborhoods, that provide this sort of green lungs for the city. So in my mind, its density is almost something to be embraced and increased, but that we need to fold in more connective, open, and transformative forms of connective linear parks and urban landscapes that can sort of change our relationship to each other, but also change our relationship to carbon emissions and climate issues, as well as kind of playing a role in bringing back biodiversity into our cities. So a couple of different levels of response to that, but I'll pass it back to my co-panelists now.
Yes, thank you, Kate. And I want in particular to turn to Flavia Neves Maya, who is one of the university's Obama Foundation scholars, a public servant, and an urban planner who is currently at Agenda Teresina 2030, a local government strategy aiming to accelerate the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals in a climate hotspot in Brazil. Flavia, you in particular, I think I want to pick up on what Kate said, which is it's not a choice between COVID and climate change and addressing one or addressing the other. They are really completely sort of intertwined in that in fact, the pandemic is a result of our unsustainable way of life. And I wanted to invite you to expand on that somewhat.
Thank you for the question, and thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. So yeah, we have been presented with a false dilemma if we need to address COVID or climate change, what we need to prioritize. And it bothers me a bit how these things are being put in opposition because they are not in opposition. Because if you see the city as a system, you understand that COVID was a shock in the system. And if you want to address COVID, you don't want just to react to COVID as a shock, you want to respond. And reacting is different from responding. So the two actions, react in the short term and respond in the long term, they have to be together if we are building resilience, not just to COVID, but to other shocks, other stresses, maybe a next pandemic. So if we want to build back better, this is the kind of system thinking that we need to have from now on. And also, I think that part of our work with dealing with COVID is go beyond the health assistance, which is super, super important right now, but start thinking about the other systems that relate to health, to think in terms of planetary health, for example, and to think about education. So, for example, a study from the Global Health Alliance shows that many epidemic diseases are linked to land use change and interactions between humans and wildlife in high biodiverse regions with growing economies. Regions like Bangladesh, India, China, and Brazil, for example. Regions like Amazonia, which is being destroyed. So the next pandemic is likely to come from cities in developing tropical regions like mine, like the one I am now. And this is not only my problem, this is a global problem. So an important part of the response is to understand vulnerable communities and the potential to release new virus based on deforestation, which is an important part of climate action. So these are not in oppositions, and I expect that the change we see in cities from now on is a change in the paradigm, from linear thinking to systems thinking, to understand sustainability as a step towards regeneration, because we don't want just to be sustainable, we don't want just to survive, we want to thrive. And instead of trying to do less harm, we want to do good. We need to aim for regeneration. This is how I see a pandemic recovery.
Thank you, Flavia. And I'm particularly interested in your sort of switching from linear thinking to systems thinking and mobilizing networks. And I want to invite Lorenzo Kihlgren Grandi here for my next question. Lorenzo is the chair of the think tank Urban Flag, an urban affairs expert and advisor and lecturer in city diplomacy at Sciences Po and the École Polytechnique in Paris. His main expertise and research interests are in the engagement of municipalities in global challenges such as sustainable development, intellectual dialogue, digital transition, and migration. So, Lorenzo, how do we mobilize towards greater urban equity? I mean, again, one of the things that COVID has brought to light so sort of in such starking contrast are these issues of equities, access, housing, basic sort of education, especially for the most vulnerable people, people of color, Black people, certainly in the US and elsewhere. How do we mobilize? How do we get people in power to think differently?
Thank you very much, Amal. It is a pleasure to be with you and with the distinguished panelists. Well, I would like to propose we adopt the lenses of the urban dimension of COVID-19. COVID-19 is a quintessential urban crisis, not only because, according to the statistics by the United Nations, around 90% of the cases take place in the urban environment, but is also because it highlights the contradiction of cities. On one side, we see the dynamism of cities that are able to swiftly react to find solutions, some of them overnight, such as deploying tactical urbanism solutions to make the mobility in cities more safe and affordable. And at the same time, we have this rising inequality, unfortunately already present and getting worse not only for where it is more visible. I think about the 1 billion people living in informal settlements around the world, which is around 24% of the human population. But also for what is more hidden, the inequalities that are revealed by data such as that published by the Department of Health of New York City, that highlights that the COVID cases are more present, is more widespread in the Bronx than in Manhattan, despite the fact that Manhattan is more dense. So density is not really the problem here. It's more about the quality of life, the quality of environment, building environment more specifically in this case, and many kind of different inequalities. So how to react? Well, this is a really challenging question. I think there is a methodology we can use, but it's not a ready-made methodology we can apply everywhere. It's more the methodology of diversity. It's a methodology of the specificities. So it is a global shock, but it is important to identify the specificities, the areas, the places, the communities, the individuals that are more challenged by this kind of crisis. And then, of course, analyze the data, spatially analyze in cooperation with the education sector, researchers, scholars, think tanks, and so on, and try to map the problems. This applies both to climate change and to the health components, of course, with their social and economic declinations. Well, that's the first step. The second step is, in fact, to reach out, to contact the people. Believe that the real solution can only be built when you interact with those that need those kind of solutions. First of all, because they're the one who knows better what they really need. It's not easy, you know, to take some solution from elsewhere and put it, even if it worked elsewhere. You really need to tailor-made it and to apply it. And you can only do this by interacting and empowering and also fostering a sense of co-responsibility with the population. And finally, the last step is the one I've been focusing more over the last few years, is actually cooperating with different levels of government. Of course, this is more and more needed. We know there will be challenges about the funding, the continuity of social services, of all that is provided by the public sector due to the resources that will be less present due to the economic shock of the pandemic. And finally, external actors, so local communities can find a lot of inspiration from other cities, not necessarily, you know, the partner you would expect. So maybe in cities in the global north and other cities in the global north, you can find solution and inspiration basically everywhere. So it's important to keep the eyes open.
I want to turn to, thank you, Lorenzo. I want to turn to Jacqueline Klopp, who has, looked at many different communities and context. Jacqueline is the co-director of the Center for Sustainable Urban Development and a research scholar who's explored the intersection of sustainable transport, land use, accountability, air pollution, climate change, and especially data and technology. And I wanted to kind of connect what Lorenzo said about mapping first and the role of research and research scholars, and then anchoring that within communities. I believe you've been working in Nairobi. And so what are models that we should be looking at that we may not be aware of already, that are emerging as kind of models that we should kind of support and accelerate and intensify? Jacqueline.
Yeah, thank you so much, Amale, and thanks for the opportunity to discuss this with you all. First, I want to say that, real change comes from mobilization and social movements, and a lot of the progress we're seeing in the United States and elsewhere comes from people really organizing, including youth, and, the people who are suffering from structural injustice, as we see with the Black Lives Matter movement. And so when we think about how now we're going to look at this from the perspective of the academy, I think it's really important to think about how we can use our skills, including looking at, I think, these mapping studies that show, for example, that the communities in the United States that were historically redlined are also the places which, for people who are not familiar with that basically means they were sort of underinvested in. They were considered places where people couldn't get mortgages, and the cities weren't investing in these places, and they were predominantly Black folks living in those places. Those are the places that experience extreme heat. So, that kind of study really shows the way that these structural problems are leading to, very adverse outcomes. And so I think in the academy, recognizing that we have these huge problems, we need to use our skills to be able to highlight them and have those kinds of public discussions that we need to have about addressing them. Because as a number of this panelists already mentioned, if we don't address these structural problems over and over again, when we face these big issues as societies, we will see disproportionate amount of effects on large numbers of people and the same numbers of people. And we can't solve these problems if we don't really address these structural problems. So I would just say that it's really important for academics to also work very closely with these communities, listen to them, understand what their problems are, and work over a longer time period. So you don't just have like a one-off project, that's more extractive. You go in and you get what you need for your paper, but that you actually engage in a way that, the research gets back to these communities in a way that's also helpful and elevates these voices in the public realm. So I love that study that I mentioned about extreme heat and the historically discriminated against communities in the United States, because people can really see how that history is leading to these adverse outcomes. And I think we have a lot of work to do.
Thank you, Jacqueline. I know we have so much work to do, and it can be overwhelming at times, but we, of course, are committed. I wanted to turn to Shannon to invite a first student question.
Yes, thank you. So our first question on this related topic is from Edna Egal, and she is actually in New York, but from Mogadishu, Somalia. Edna is a Columbia College student studying computer science and African studies and will be graduating next year. Her question is as follows. With more than 90% of all COVID cases reported in urban areas, we saw dramatic reductions in vehicular traffic and energy consumption. As we move beyond the pandemic to a post-COVID reality over the next few years, are there opportunities to maintain some of these environmental benefits? Open to the panel.
I'm happy to answer that quickly. Yeah, I think that's a superb question. We saw the air pollution decline in a number of cities because there wasn't economic activity, so people weren't, in cars, which is one of the major sources. And there was decline in energy consumption, which is another source of pollution with very serious health effects. As an advocate for public transport, non-motorized transport, I would say we have huge opportunities now to shift investment into public transport so people are not in those cars. And also we found people cycling a lot all over the world. There's a huge advocacy group in Nairobi that really wants to see cycle lanes. I think your mayor, Lorenzo, in Paris has massively expanded these infrastructures that are clean and healthy and reduce our energy consumption and address climate change. So there is an enormous opportunity now to shift our investment, but it's not going to happen unless we mobilize like we had discussed earlier. So thank you, Edna. Great question.
If possible, I would like to add something on that point. I think it's really a wonderful question, and I totally agree with Professor Klopp on this analysis. I also would like to add a more psychological point of view. In fact, I believe we are experiencing a different way of seeing to nature, especially in urban nature and the environment in general. We have been all affected by the images that have been mentioned by Dr. Masri in the opening of this empty streets, somehow also the return of nature in our city centers with wildlife. You have maybe seen the photos of dolphins in Venice, deers and boars in city centers and so on. This actually has been changing the perception of nature, as well as the fact that the boundaries are extremely important. We know the origins of this pandemic has been the fact that we didn't respect the boundaries. We expanded without respect for nature. So this is just to say that there is always a cost, a political cost in implementing environmental policies, such as expanding the place for what is called slow mobility, walking, cycling, and so on. There is always political cost. All these people will have to disagree in a part of the population, but this cost is getting smaller. So it's a good, we have a momentum now, and local leaders that want to go further, they can benefit from this psychological impact of getting closer, wish to getting closer to nature and respect it as an effect of the pandemic.
Thank you, Lorenzo. I think this really brings me to Kate's work that has been thickening boundaries, and I wanted and complicating them. I wanted, in particular, Kate, to turn to you and your concept of water urbanism, which you've really developed in your own work, and as a kind of, how do we reintegrate? If water is coming, what how do we move forward with that?
Yeah, and just a quick kind of hang on to the last question too, which is we simply have to mobilize now to make these changes, right? That to the point of, that we have somehow during COVID have a less intensive carbon pattern and form of life. And the idea of, being incredibly creative and forward thinking in this moment, whether it means ripping up a lane of highway and adding back a bike lane, adding linear green infrastructure. We have a mentality around cities, which is about, it's just an additive mentality. We're going to solve things by adding. And I feel like this is a completely new approach that we've, I think, learned during COVID, that behavior change is as powerful a force as anything when we think about climate change. And for example, in the New York City region, we have temporary street closures. We simply need to be bold and aggressive and begin to transform these sort of temporary street closures into more green, connective, and expansive corridors. And just to sort of move forward on that concept of development as a kind of a mindset around which we wrap around the concept of the city, I feel like we need to also explode that mindset. I mean, one of my most profound lessons in traveling to almost 20 cities worldwide and looking at water and the lens of water in global cities with a particular focus on equity and climate has been the East Calcutta wetlands. I don't know if there's a familiarity with this, but this is an incredible sort of human-made ecosystem to the east of one of the densest cities in the world, Calcutta, India. And it is a beautiful mosaic of farmland, farmed plots, fish ponds, open marshlands that helps to essentially filter and treat the sewage from Calcutta, but is an incredibly productive landscape. So when we think about, developments, that landscape is threatened right now, right? It has been almost filled and developed by half. So I also just think that when we're thinking about water, we're thinking about cities, we have to very aggressively think in this systemic way that Flavia had brought forward, and understand that connections between things, work as hard as we possibly can to stop severing those connections, and work also to sort of reconnect and enable the sort of water systems that underpin our livelihoods, our life, and our our ecosystems, our habitat corridors, and really learn from water now as we move into this next century, rather than have this additive mentality driven by oil and a kind of a colonialist mindset of expansion.
Thanks, Kate. And you mentioned, I wanted to turn to Flavia. You know, when we talk about climate change, we also talk about climate justice and the engagement that Lorenzo was mentioning in terms of how do we work with communities. And Flavia, your own work is so focused on issues of equity and gender equity in particular. And I wanted to know a little bit more about, you know, as a model of work, how do you develop sort of more participatory forms of engagement as kind of Kate is also suggesting?
Yes, I think we have to understand, like, have a critical perspective on participation. Why do we need participation in the first place? And I really like the way we say in Brazil that social and environmental vulnerability and justice, it's not possible to separate. We even have a word for that, socioambiental, which would be like social environmental, like clustered in one word. Just to give you an idea that social justice and climate justice, they are the same thing. And about participation, I really like when I say that I like to address critically, I like to put a feminist and a decolonial lenses over participation. What we need to build institutional capacity for participation in Latin America and Central America, for example, and how the planet can learn with us. So I think the first thing we need is money. Local governments need budget to do this, especially now that tax collection was limited, but we need much more grants than loans. We cannot put yet another burden over the next generations, but we need to use money wisely, so we have to end corruption. Corruption is disempowering, there is no participation if there is corruption, there's no effective management, there's no leadership. So this would be like the first step. The second one is that we want institutions to work better, and institutions work through people. So we need to train, to connect leaders, to connect public leaders, civil servants, to assure that they are the ones that will be held accountable by the population. And we need that our municipal plans, they dialogue with the Agenda 2030, with the Sustainable Development Goals. Because if there is a political change, a political shift, the government will be held accountable. The third thing I would say is for participation to be authentic, we need to go where people are and use accessible language. There are many methodologies. I really like the one created by Paulo Freire, a Brazilian educator, and it's called The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And he teaches how we can access people that are experiencing different power dynamics and that not use it to be included. And the fourth step, I would say, is to mind the gender gaps and to mind gender bias. Because when you talk about stakeholders, you have to think who are these stakeholders. For example, just to give you an idea, according to the Gender Equality Observatory of the United Nations, in Latin America, only 20% of mayors are women. And we need like much more than that to represent society, especially if you understand that local leaders in the context of climate change are global leaders. So participation has like these many layers. To ensure participation, you have to ensure the integrity of the systems. And here it comes systems thinking again. Thinking about participation, not just as the space that you open for people to communicate their needs, but as part of this structure of this system that has to have integrity so you can have authentic participation.
Thank you, Flavia. And I wanted to build on that and invite Lorenzo to expand on the notion of subnational climate diplomacy in particular, which is really talking about this empowerment of the local modes of governments.
Thank you very much, Amal. Well, I have to say that local governments and cities in particular are extremely active. They have shown repeatedly that climate change is a political priority. So we have more than 50 networks around the world that connect local governments and cities in order to join forces, both in the advocacy and in creation of concrete and tangible initiatives that can fight climate change in particular, or define different action and strategies to adapt and mitigate. Just a few examples. The Global Covenant of Mayors reunites more than 10,000 local governments. You have ICLEI, which is another city network with 1,700 cities and local governments that are part of it, or C40, which is a relatively small city network with 97 cities, but those cities are extremely important. They represent 25% of the world GDP. And these are just three of the 50 networks that are extremely active, and they have a lot of impact. They are starting now to also measure the impact in terms of tons of CO2 that are eliminated through the threshold, the limits that are designed and implemented through this cooperation. So this is something effective and growing. Nevertheless, there is a lot of work to be done, and these networks, they are putting an accent on what remains somehow a challenge for the future, and that reconnects with what the other panelists were saying before. So definitely the transparency. This is, I agree with Flavia, this is an element extremely important, transparency, accountability. So it is important to have specific goals, specific challenges, paths that are chosen, are communicated with the population, are shared, and the population is empowered. And there is also a little bit of duplication as well as opportunistic membership, I have to say, in this network. So it is important, to be sure that there is a good will of the local leaders, and this will is implemented through this cooperation, this engagement with the population. This is definitely something that also can be transposed in other kind of sectors, because cities are cooperating with each other in all other components of sustainable development, such as inclusion, for example, the impact of migration laws, the will of including and valuing diversity, as well as digital transition, for example, mobility, and so on. So there is always this strong political commitment of cities, but that needs to go with capacity to connect the global to the local.
We come back to always this, how do we connect the dots? How do we make them visible, but then actually connect them and to make sure that the actions that are being implemented are both visible, transparent, accountable. I wanted to turn to Shannon, and I'm cognizant of time, with two questions, or one on the question of engagement and really the impact of climate change on cities from two students. And then I think, Safwan, maybe we should open it up, and I should turn it over to you to make sure that there's a little time enough time for student questions that are live at this moment.
Absolutely, and also questions from our global audiences. We have quite a number of them, but we'll first give a chance to the students who submitted questions to Shannon. So Shannon, over to you.
Sure. I'd like to invite Suleiman Ahmed, who is live with us today and has a question regarding the role of engagement. Suleiman.
Hi, my name is Suleiman. I am from Chicago, and I'm a freshman at Columbia College. And my question is this: oftentimes it seems that sustainable development in cities is a luxury and not a necessity. For example, in my neighborhood, we're installing permeable pavers and other green infrastructure, but that comes at a very high cost. Other neighborhoods in Chicago don't even have proper drainage along the curbs to accommodate heavy rain. So what are some ways that we can improve the affordability and increase equity in future sustainable developments?
May I jump in?
Yes, please, Flavia.
Thank you for your question. I would start with learning with nature and learning with vulnerable communities. especially across the global south. A Brazilian urban planner, Jaime Lerner, who invented the bus rapid transportation, has a quote that I really like. He says that creativity starts when you cut a zero from your budget. So think about a nature-based solution for permeability. Do you always need a pavement, a high-tech pavement? Or maybe you can work with your neighbors in that part of your private lands and public lands as close as possible to their natural state. Do you always need like a green roof or a green wall for every single building, or you can work to regenerate nature and improve the relationship between buildings and green areas? So I think that thinking that high-tech solutions are like the only or the main way to go green is a very Western, white, male, and linear way of thinking about sustainability.
Yeah, and interestingly, I also felt like during COVID, I felt that, and I mean, Amal, being an architect, I'm sure you have some reflections as well, but the ultimate luxury was to have openable windows and a high density, low rise environment, which which, you know, maybe it would be characterized not to be seen as like a high luxury sustainable development. It was the ultimate ability to open a window, and much of, I would say, the so-called, you know, modern high-tech development in the past 20 years has been about sealing off the windows, having some sort of, you know, a sort of elaborate, ventilation system, elevators that will, you know, quickly whisk you 34 floors up. And so what has been revealed in incredibly dramatic ways is that the fragility of these so-called high-tech sustainable systems, when what is truly sort of resilient or able to adapt to current conditions are systems that can be, that come back to the human scale and agency. So like Flavia is saying, whether that's, you know, building a bioswale, or whether that's, you know, the ability to open a window in your dwelling, there's been a complete inversion, I think, of what we associate with high-end sustainable design. And from a landscape standpoint, for me, that has also come to the fore in terms of, again, preserving the systems that we have now, not necessarily, you know, sort of adding new systems. It's about maintaining some of the connectivity that we have now, and valuing the landscapes that are in our immediate neighborhoods.
I would just jump in quickly and say to Suleiman, though, that you do need to have metrics that look at equity, and we often don't factor that into investments in a transparent way. So I do think there is a movement, at least now in the US, to start factoring that in and making cities and states accountable, and the federal government accountable for where these investments are going. A lot of times, some of the metrics are like how much property is going to be damaged and what is the value of that property. And so that is a bias towards wealthier neighborhoods. So we really must address these injustices, and have, like Flavia and Kate are saying, creative, you know, solutions developed with those communities. But basic infrastructure like drainage should work, and there is no reason why there would be inequality in that, except for, you know, this structural racism or neglect, and that must be addressed. So I thank you for your question. I think it's a good one.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Shannon, we have another student.
Yes, and thank you, Suleiman. It's so great to see you today. So our next student is Eleanor Campbell. Eleanor, could you introduce yourself and state where you're from and your major?
Yes, hello, I'm Eleanor Campbell. I'm from Raleigh, North Carolina. I'm a first year in Columbia College, planning to major in economics. And my question is about whether it is easier and more efficient to build a new sustainable city and sort of plan it that way, or if it is easier and more efficient to rethink an existing city and try to adapt it to be more sustainable.
Anyone want to take that one?
Maybe I can try to answer this. There are currently some attempt to build new sustainable and smart cities across the world that are extremely interesting. This is happening particularly in East Asia or in the Gulf region. And this is something that have all the experts and architects, urbanists with the wide eyes open to see how this can be done. And there is no doubt that there are very interesting solutions for that. But we have to take into consideration that generally speaking, there is a lot of bad environmental impact when you build. This is one of the sectors that cities are working the most to make it more green, but it's still one of the most polluting one. So retrofitting, adapting, improving the quality of what is already available is what most cities are currently working on in cooperation with each other. And it's interesting to see that, as I mentioned at the beginning, those kind of cooperation are not necessarily between cities that would spot up as similar. There is an example of how the water is collected, for the raining water is collected in Mexico City. Mexico City is a city that is prone to floods due to these abundant rains happening in moments of the year. And Rotterdam, a city that you might not immediately associate with Mexico City, cooperate in designing new systems to cope with this specific challenge and make the city more sustainable and more lively. So that's just an example, and this is happening worldwide to come up with solutions, especially those, and I want to agree with my fellow panelists. Most of the time, we have solutions that are easy, that are not very costly, that can be adapted. Of course, there is a need of having a risk-taking vision, especially for people putting the money, for either the city council or external partners, including donors. When we talk about cities in developing countries, it is important to understand that you have to trust the people, you have to trust the priorities that are expressed, and also try something new that is emerging. Maybe solutions are already there, just empower them. This is another opportunity. You need to be brave as a local leader for that.
Thank you, Lorenzo, and thank you, Eleanor. This is certainly, as an architect, we have committed crimes by always going to the new. And so I think the idea that we both need to explore, but also preserve and adapt and reuse is really one of the aspects that I think is most exciting right now in architecture. So thank you so much for this question. Safwan, wanted to turn it over to you and make sure that our global audience gets a chance also to ask questions.
Thank you, Amale. I just want to say how great it is to see the students. I mean, all the students' questions are terrific, and to be able to see visually Eleanor and Suleiman, two first-year students who are not on campus yet, at least from your introductions, that's very clear. So I just want to salute you and tell you how incredibly we feel for the experience that you're having studying remotely, and how much we look forward to seeing you back on campus, how much I look forward to being back on campus. I've been in Jordan, my second home, since the outbreak back in March. So we all look forward to being together very soon. But I know how, and I just want to recognize, that we appreciate how difficult this must be. And thanks to Shannon and to the collaboratory, and to all of you, it's wonderful that you are connected, and we are connected with you in this manner. And trust me, I think that this is going to make your overall education far stronger. And I think it's going to make you far more robust individuals in your futures. So with that, we have so many questions from the global audiences, and we're not going to be able to get to all of them. And I tried to put some together as much as possible. But let me start with Rodrigo Pizarro from Chile, who is referencing a system of indicators and standards of urban development that allow observing the behavior of cities from various fields. Rodrigo is saying that COVID has shown a great pressure on cities, knowing that half of the world's population lives in urban areas. What is the contribution of the study centers to lower the pressure in times of crisis? So said another way, or at least my interpretation of the question, which may not be fair, but perhaps, what lessons have we learned that we can apply to try to lower the pressure on large urban centers? Anyone? Amal, do you want to direct it, or shall I ask maybe Lorenzo to take that one, and everybody else can jump in?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Safwan. There is a blossoming of research and the desire of different scholars from different disciplines to contribute and try to ease the tensions on cities, especially large cities, for the upcoming years and in a sustainable long-term way. There is an example I could cite is that of the 15-minute city. You may have heard of it. Has been one of the most popular paradigm that has been developed by university professor Carlos Moreno at Sorbonne University and quickly adapted, in fact, here in Paris. The idea is to redesign cities in order to have all the main services and activities in close proximity. 15 minutes is the time you have to take to go to the hospital, to university, to buy the groceries, as well as to go to theater or go to the gym. So basically having a multicentricity of these large cities, then rediscover somehow a sort of a village point of view, having multiple centers that interact with each other. Of course, this is quite easy to organize in cities that were already conceived before this a crisis in a similar way, which is most ancient cities, while you have cities that have been built or developed mainly in the 20th century. So counting on the use of the car that has spread so much, it is much harder, of course, to have Los Angeles as a 15-minute city than Paris as a 15-minute city. But nevertheless, this is fueling a sort of reflection. What I want to say is that I'm really glad to see that universities, research centers, think tanks, and so on are putting themselves in dialogue with local leaders, with decision makers, with the society, and they want to contribute. This is extremely important. Those the academia and the decision-making process is learning. They are learning both to dialogue more and more effectively, and this is a key to have sustainable solutions, because both can in fact benefit a lot from the other. Of course, the academia receiving data that they can analyze and implement and build their theories on that, and of course those theories, those analyses, they can benefit deeply the decision-making process.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lorenzo. Anyone else? Kate?
I was just going to add, I mean, I think to some degree, there's what we've learned is that everything old is new again. You know, what was just described by Lorenzo, it sounds a lot like a village and, you know, and an intact agricultural landscape or forests on the edge of town. And so I do think one of the primary challenges moving forward in the next decades, next generations, is to try to understand and weave back the mosaic, intact mosaic of landscapes that, you know, support us, that give us food, and but to, you know, think about these systems in a way that just increases equity and sort of really rebuilds kind of, you know, democratic processes. So everything old and new except our political
So, I mean, I want to pick up on your answer and on Lorenzo's because, Tariq, it sort of addresses, I think, already a question that is being posed by Tariq Wafiq in Cairo. I think he's a student at Cairo University. And basically, Tariq is proposing that perhaps, with COVID, we've learned to rely on more remote communications, much less direct contacts and socialization. Do you think that this will contribute to a greater number of smaller cities? Lorenzo, you talked about the villages. Benefits of congregation in big scale will be relatively diminishing. And then his question is, how do we factor that into future planning concepts? So I think that that's a really great question to follow up on what you've shared. And maybe let me attach to it another question from Abir Sahib, who's asking, to what extent do you think existing cities' operations and governance structures will be able to respond quickly or rightly to required changes for cities' functioning and management and so on? So both on the, how well cities adapt and do things, and maybe Flavia and Jackie can try to address that. But maybe before we do that, we try to address Wafiq's question about the concept that you proposed, Lorenzo.
I'm happy to jump in. I think that, well, there was a lot of discussion about how, more remote working will mean that fewer people will want to congregate in cities. I think that that's probably not true. I think there are so many benefits from being in a diverse, dense environment that what we've seen historically is that cities continue to grow and grow. Those chance encounters are incredibly important for innovation. So I'm not convinced that cities are necessarily not going to continue to grow. But we already have lots of small cities, I should say, that a large number of the people who live in cities live in small cities. I think you're, coming from an Egyptian perspective where Cairo is such an enormous city and such a huge, factor in the country. So I can understand your concern about maybe distributing more resources. And I think that is actually across these different kinds of cities. And I think that's really, really important. I don't think it will necessarily be driven by just technology. I think that has to be driven by policy of how we also support and balance investments in our different cities. But I think it's a great question.
Anyone else?
I just wanted to maybe jump in because I feel like there's a string here where we have to define again what a city is. And the question is really the question of scale, right? At what scale do systems function? And at what scale do they start breaking down? And I think, the 15-minute city is a question of scale. What Kate is describing as, the kind of low rise, and Jacqueline, what you're also hinting at. And, while certainly the large cities have seen maybe people move away, what I'm hearing is there's a kind of re-energizing of, especially in the US, of secondary cities and cities that are more manageable. And and I think that probably ties to the question of governance and government. Why is it that mayors and have been able to organize, and we've seen this kind of scale of operation being able to be networked in an easier way than, let's say, large scale. And that goes back to, again, Kate's kind of large infrastructures and, these monumental 20th century interventions and scales may not be the right ones to be nimble and adaptable. So I was just curious about, shifting from the question of city to the question of scale.
Sorry.
Flavia,
yeah. I agree with my colleagues, and I find super hard to do generalizations at this moment. And also, I have to bring about, again, the systems thinking, because what happens now is that we think because we are in social isolation, therefore, maybe we are living isolated. So this is a linear mode of thinking. but the process is underway. And maybe for some systems, for example, the health systems, it makes sense for us to be in dense cities. But for others, it doesn't make sense. So just to highlight this property of systems thinking called non-linearity, which means that a type of behavior in which the effect is disproportionate from the cause. So we are in this process of causes that are disproportionate to the effect. The process is going on, so it's hard to make predictions.
Lorenzo?
Thank you, Safwan. I totally agree with Flavia. We have some new phenomenon that is emerging now. For example, you may have heard of the city quitters phenomenon. So those professionals that quit the large city to go in sometimes not even secondary, but tertiary cities, even small villages on the mountains or the countryside, where they have, of course, a broadband to connect with the rest of the world, but they enjoy a more appeasing and more healthy, supposedly healthy lifestyle. Well, I do think it's really too early to say how much extent this impact will have. I agree with Jacqueline. This probably, I still believe in the capacity of cities to attract and grow and continue to grow over the next decades. Especially this growth will happen in Asia and in Africa, that are the least urbanized regions in the world in terms of percentage of urban population, but they will be the most urbanized in the upcoming years. To comment on the point on the scale of Amale, I think we can relate that to a risk that it deserves to be mentioned, at least the risk of inequalities between centers, between urban phenomenon across the world and inside of different countries, because we have this attractivity of big poles that they attract resources, they attract investment, talents, services, and this is evident everywhere. The metropolitan effect, where you find so much concentration of the dynamics that are shaping our life and our world, and there is a sort of loss. This corresponds to a loss of resources to many other cities that are less appealing. And I have to say that the capacity of cities to connect with the international, as long as it remains a capacity only of big global cities, will in fact produce even more inequality. So it is important, from my point of view, that there is a multi-level approach for that. So the national, the provincial, regional, and national governments, or supranational, as well in regional and global organization, they should make sure that there is not this kind of competition and sort of agglomeration of all resources in only a few little number of cities, but rather synergies. And of course, how to build synergies between cities, it's a big discourse, but there are wonderful examples of how this can be done, of wonderful functional metropolitan areas extending for hundreds of kilometers with cities in the center, where you have the pros of different urban areas that are joined together, and there is a collaborative, friendly cooperation that benefits all cities together.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Thank you. I mean, we talk in terms of leadership, in terms of governance and political governance in particular, the sort of the agility and the effectiveness of having a good mayor in charge, that cities are sort of, more easily governable, if you will, if you have the right kind of leadership in place, than countries, maybe. So maybe, this is a question from me, and maybe any of you can take it, but I'd be interested in what you think. I mean, you have Anne Hidalgo, for example, in Paris, who has put environmental sustainability as a priority. We had Michael Bloomberg in New York, who had done that. There are many other examples. Flavia, I'm very happy to see that Eduardo Paes is back to being mayor of Rio de Janeiro. And I should say that Eduardo Paes is the reason why the School of Architecture led the path for Colombia to have a global center and to have presence in Rio de Janeiro. So I wonder if we can have just a quick reaction to that question.
I can take it with pleasure. And yeah, absolutely. The mayor is the leader of changement, and it has a sort of approval and support of population, generally speaking, much higher than representatives of the government. On a global scale, you see there is a capacity of mayor to reunite rather than divide, and apply very tangible, impactful solutions to the city. So this is wonderful because, Fiorello LaGuardia, the mayor of New York, became famous because he said there is no Republican or Democratic way to repair the sewage. You have to get it done. And this is a little bit what mayors are doing. They are cooperating regardless of their political vision in order to bring effective change in the world. Of course, this is something that is, it's a political game, so it needs for consensus to be built. Once again, it's not enough to have inspired mayors. Those inspired mayors, they have to do the extra mile and connect with the population to create the co-creation frameworks, co-responsibility frameworks in order to go the extra mile with the whole population and eventually benefit from the resources, the energy, and the dynamism of the population. The COVID-19 crisis has really shown that how ambitious mayor, they need their city, they need their citizens, they need the local actors. I take the example of Milan, that was the first big Western city to be hit by the pandemic. And so the social and economic impact, of course, was very hard to manage, especially for what it's about food security. So bring food to the growing population that needed support for the food security. And the idea of the mayor of Milan was, in fact, Giuseppe Sala, to establish a sort of framework of cooperation shared by the municipality with all the different actors, mainly charities, but also the private sector, helping and cooperating in tackling food insecurity. So this idea of having a sort of a director of all this common effort has then been a source of inspiration for many other cities across the world that had to deal with similar challenge.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Kate?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think the unit of the mayor, to build on Amal's point about scale, is somehow a manageable unit of thinking, acting that coincides with a very visible and real, tangible, improvement of urban systems, right, where we can kick the tires, so to speak, in our immediate environment. And but it's something to truly celebrate, because it's a scale of a unit of inhabitation that seems to be within our grasp to manage. I would just then pivot to, I know on the agenda for discussion today was also climate, but I do feel like that is where we see the breakdown, because in order to truly decarbonize our economy, and to, this would require, frankly, federal, if not global, agreements relative to decarbonization, a change in the way that we subsidize oil and gas, and in this kind of global handshake that we need to make relative to, not punishing the poorest of the poor in the world relative to the immediate and sudden need, frankly, to reduce carbon. So I so applaud, and I think the mayors are true heroes who are able to work with design, management, policy to get things done. And maybe I would love to hear from other panelists as well around the other scales which seem somehow beyond our grasp, just as they become so incredibly important relative to, frankly, decarbonization and jobs and justice.
Yeah, and Kate, actually, this brings up a question that's being asked by Gabrielle Adeninos, who is a student at NYU, and is asking for comments by the panelists on the recently promoted well standards for buildings like the Vanderbilt one next to Grand Central Station in New York. You know, the standard of at least 30% green plants and trees inside buildings, super clean air from high standards HVAC systems, clean water, and so on. So could any of you comment on this? Maybe Amal. And I should have mentioned in my introduction of Amal in that her company is in partnership with her husband, the architect Dan Wood. So Dan, if you're listening in, hi.
Thank you, Safwan. Yeah, I think I want to again tie it to the conversation. I think that's the complicated part now, is that we have to engage at all scales and at all levels, like everything from the performance of buildings to retrofitting to more urban nature to very large scale kind of interventions in terms of reaching you know, like no more concrete, no more steel, you know, these, you know, if you think about the building industry. And so, you know, all those actions are needed across multi-layered of scales, and then how to connect those becomes crucial. But you know, we had a very interesting talk by Ed Masri here at the Graduate School of Architecture, who founded Architecture 2030, and you know, has been now for decades looking at the impact of building, as Lorenzo mentioned, you know, on carbon emissions. And you know, he is cautiously optimistic that by you know, if you think about a 10-year window, at least in the US, if you just take that as another scale, you know, if every building now needs to, will need to be retrofitted once, and you have, you know, guidelines that need to be met, that the retrofitting will be quite impactful. But then, of course, you have to, as Lorenzo said, you know, think about what's happening in Africa, you know, and urbanization in Asia, et cetera. And you know, we're all connected. I think that's, you know, Kate's point is that you can't, it's very hard to, while the mayor scale is a great scale, there's no boundaries anymore. And so all of these initiatives, and we need everything, you know, at all scales. So
yeah. So we have two groupings of questions, and that I think, you know, we will finish with, and I'm going to read the groupings together and then see how we might address them. So one is, you know, broadly speaking about technology and artificial intelligence, subject that we touched upon a little bit earlier on. So Salim Karachi from Amman is asking about the new Saudi city NEOM. And you know, what potential does it have to act as any kind of a prototype for meeting the challenges we have been discussing? Bustamante Ivan is also asking about the role of artificial intelligence in modifying urban spaces. Yeah, so let me stop with those two. So can we, I mean, you know, the role of artificial intelligence, the role of technology, to, you know, how accessible also will all this be? I mean, is NEOM in Saudi Arabia sort of a standalone kind of a thing, or can it serve as any kind of a prototype for other developments of new types of cities? Jackie, you want to take that one?
I'd love to take that. So we're in the middle of a lot of technological transformation, as you're pointing out. We have massive amounts of data right now, and we're developing systems that can do machine learning and artificial intelligence, like you're saying. And these have huge implications. And the implications for cities depends on how cities are going to build capacities to use these, but also regulate. I think there was another question about privacy, which would be a big issue in Saudi Arabia, because honestly, now every time you turn on, you use your phone to do almost anything, it locates you. And your information is going off to somebody. If your digital information is not protected, you don't understand your digital rights, there's a lot of abuse that can happen that can undermine a lot of the processes that we depend on to run cities well. So a huge amount now depends upon citizens and cities understanding this technology and using it for the civic good. And some cities, mostly in Europe, are starting to develop charters of digital rights, and maybe Lorenzo can speak to this, to really start to get a grasp on this problem. Also even having chief privacy officers so that cities can use the data that's coming out of these new technologies to improve services, improve interaction with citizens, develop civic technologies, but also protect citizens' rights and make sure that many of these big companies that are tech companies, whether it's Uber or Google, that have huge presence in our cities globally, also are regulated so that what they're doing feeds into a progressive vision for the city. Lorenzo, did you want to speak to this? Don't want to put you.
With great pleasure. In fact, it's one of the most promising field of interaction between mayors. And you're right to say it's particularly evident in Europe. We have this dual problem you were mentioning. On one side, the use of data that can determine real inequalities between those cities that are able to use them in an efficient way and those who do not have the tools nor the capacities to analyze them to make something which is useful and is put available to the population. So this is the challenge number one. The second challenge, as you mentioned, the privacy, the rights of citizens, how to make sure those two elements are covered. And we have cities that are emerging as leaders. Once again, we can reconnect that to the role of mayors, a number of mayors. Madame Hidalgo is one of those. Many cities in Europe are actually involved in, for example, Ada Colau in Barcelona, Mayor Müller in Berlin, I already mentioned Sala in Milan. So those mayors, they're making sure there are both the availability of platforms, including the platform for visualization of data, which is important for the communication with population, as well as a joint advocacy initiative to make sure that the rights of citizens are taken into due consideration. And this is particularly evident in the use of technology by the private sector. So we have companies, especially those who rent apartments and those who have services of transportation, like taxi-like transportation, not to mention vans. Those companies are object of separate negotiation and sometimes confrontation with cities. And cities, they have realized over the last few years, it's more efficient, in fact, to cooperate and establish a series of charter, a series of list of values that they want the private sector to comply. So this is happening very strongly at European level. But this is something that can be, of course, shared and basically all cities in the world can adapt this kind of approach. European Union is also supporting these two approaches, I have to say, especially for what is data, because the European Union is providing a free platform for the analysis and visualization of data to municipalities, also providing support to civil servants to learn and adapt this kind of platform, which of course is something extra.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Thank you. So I'm going to turn to our last set of questions, which are interconnected, and they all have to do with awareness, building awareness and education, which is a great theme, I think, to end this webinar on, since this is part of the collaboratory and it's all about education. And I'll ask you, I'm going to call on each of you maybe to say something about that and to give any kind of concluding remarks. Amale, does that sound fine?
That sounds perfect, Safwan. Yes.
Okay, thank you. So you know, Tekin Sura from Turkey, for example, she's an English language teacher, and she's asking, you know, can you point to sustainable practices to foster ecological consciousness, especially among students? So this is a teacher, a school teacher, and you know, how does she help learners appreciate and foster ecological consciousness? Ines Suaya is asking, you know, that most people are not familiar with climate change and how to embrace sustainable lifestyle because they really have received no education on the topic. So, you know, similar question to Tekken Sura. Megan Amsalem is also asking, what steps would you recommend that individuals take to make a positive difference in their community and service models? Ruth Pottigheimer is asking about you know, food demands and the requirements that come in terms of deforestation and industrial waste, environmental degradation, and energy use. How can this be returned to public discussion? So both in terms of awareness and education, but also how do we help bring these issues into greater public discourse so that it's not, you know, all of us who are convinced of this are preaching to the choir. How do we expand the base, if you will? So I'm going to start with you, Flavia, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I enjoy talking about education, especially in this context. I think, if I may say, that education, we need to pop the bubble, the bubble of climate education, because sometimes I think climate debate is very wide and very elitist. Part of the content is in English, and when it's another language, it's outdated. So if we want to co-create knowledge, we need to work on simple things as translating content. About ideas, how to expand awareness and how to expand environmental education, I really like the concept of deep learning, of cognition in learning, which is also a systems thinking property. And this one I am particularly attentive to, because I like the way we see in Brazil, especially some indigenous ethnicities, and I will quote indigenous leader and environmentalist that I admire a lot. Is Ailton Krenak, and he likes to tell the story about how his village is next to a mountain, and when people look at this mountain and see if this mountain is clouded or if it's not clouded, it kind of influences the mood of the social relations. And what he wants is to explain that we need to learn with the environment, that we are not isolated from the environment, that we need to think nature as we are not only part of it, but we are nature. So I'm not saying that we should all see mountains and rivers as our relatives, as the indigenous populations do, but maybe if we can see them as part of a cycle, that we are also part of it. This is super helpful. If you see rivers, lakes, oceans as part of the water cycle, if you are also part of the water cycle, you will expand your awareness. You will understand the systems, and it's much easier to educate people in this sense if you understand as part of the whole.
Thank you, Flavia. Thank you. Jackie, may I turn to you?
Sure. What wonderful questions. Yeah, I think this idea of learning, you know, in context is really important. So I think with students, you can even get them to think about what they consume. We haven't talked about consumption so much, but the things that they do in their day that they consume and throw away. That's a very easy thing to get them to think about. Well, where does that go? And what am I using? And where did it come from? Because we do have a global consumption problem. Somebody mentioned deforestation and the need for food. And the truth is that the wealthier countries consume an enormous amount per capita. Right. There was also a question about cities and oceans. I mean, think about our plastics use in the cities also that goes into the oceans, a huge problem. So, you know, I think getting students to think about that, and then also to look around their context to see the way that the built environment and the way that we live as humans is connected to the natural world. Whether, you know, that's seeing the, you know, the park space and the, you know, as Kate mentioned, the biodiversity that exists there. There's this remarkable thing that's happened in New York since COVID, where all kinds of birds have become celebrities. So we, you know, we have an owl in our park nearby, and there's always the paparazzi around the owl. People are recognizing that cities actually are places that, you know, are also shared with so many different species. And there's many things we can do to sort of improve that, learn that, and learn from nature to improve our cities. And I just want to also say that, you know, we do need to really change our curriculum. Right now at Columbia, we're working on something called the Climate School, and how can we build a curriculum to really make sure people understand these great interconnections that we've been talking about, you know, how we are all on this, you know, planet together. So I think there are a lot of things that we need to do. And I'm going to finally say the one thing that gives me hope every single day is the young people, including the people who are on this call, the questions that are being asked, the ways that young people are mobilizing, and not accepting, you know, that the future is determined by what has happened in the past, and reimagining our future. So I salute the young people on this call who are going to make a difference, and we're here to help and cooperate with you.
And we apologize to them for what they are inheriting from us.
Absolutely, we do.
Kate?
Great. Well, Flavia and Jackie have outlined some broader themes. I thought maybe to answer in a very direct and specific way in terms of truly curricular innovations that I've seen and have been inspired by. So, for example, in the New York region, I'm on the board of the Billion Oyster Project, which is a high school certified applied science-based learning state certified curriculum that is emphasizing hands-on restoration of our marine environment. So it is learning by doing and a true kind of innovation relative to applied learning. Obviously, one can imagine this sort of model of high school learning sort of applied in many contexts to reforestation, to combating desertification in different environments, et cetera, and to restoring our marine biodiversity in the form of reintroducing the Eastern oyster to our shores here in New York. To me, that is an example of high school curriculum. And, you know, with at GSAP, in the School of Architecture, I feel like the other, you know, way that we've been trying to move, in particular in this form of the water urbanism studios, has been to connect cities, to sort of rebuild and mobilize networks and connect cities to each other by bringing the same intensity of study, the same thematic lens to cities around the world, acknowledging the challenges and opportunities that are shared, but also kind of diving really deep, pun intended, into the unique specificity of people in place. So I think universities, in changing our methods and how we work and how we, you know, I've been a huge advocate in the Columbia Climate School discussion on the periphery, of course, but to sort of center the methods around this kind of studio-based learning, which is a unit of our curriculum, which is both speculative and propositional, but that is grounded in research and cross-disciplinary collaboration. So I truly feel that at the university level as well, we can modify, do our version of the Billion Oyster curriculum and build up this knowledge over time, over decades, to truly kind of have a sort of an educative model that is, you know, inclusive, that builds on our interdisciplinary intelligence and strength, but that is actually kind of learning by doing.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you. Very powerful. Lorenzo?
I would like to propose something that has been applied in a few cities and was actually, in fact, to deal with the education sector as actually a sort of self-fulfilling mechanism in order to spread some positive societal change. And this is done, and more effectively is done, in fact, at the lower levels of education. So you have many municipalities, given the fact that municipalities often have either control or have a strong relationship with the first level education, like elementary school, primary school, and so on, they can explain pupils, can explain young students what are the risks we are going to, what are the challenges of our time, and have them convinced, and then have them spread the change with their parents. The city of Milan, in fact, arrived to recycle around 70% of waste, thanks to many, of course, it's a broad strategy, by key cornerstone, and a key element in this strategy was, in fact, the capacity of having the students teach their parents how to recycle properly the different elements of waste. And so this is for the first levels of education, but I believe there is I welcome the proposal of Colombia to expand and focus on climate change. And I think an element that can be useful to focus on is that of urban journalism. So it's important to tell the stories of cities. It's important, as Jacqueline mentioned before, the animals, the nature that is invading our cities. This is extremely important to give a voice to, and to give a voice not only to animal and plants, but also to what inspiring individuals and companies and NGOs they are doing, so that we can, first of all, give visibility to those who deserve it, and then get inspired.
Thank you, Lorenzo. So as I turn it over to Amal to address this and to wrap up the discussion before we turn it over to Shannon to close it out, I just want to say, I mean, I could go on listening to you for hours on end. I mean, this has just been exceptional. Really, really very instructive, and thank you for the richness and the texture that you have provided to this. Thank you, Amal, for organizing and for leading this. And thank you, Kate, Lorenzo, Flavia, and Jackie, really from the bottom of my heart. So turn it over to you, Amal, to address these questions, wrap up the discussion, and then Shannon will close it for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Safwan. I feel the same. It's just been wonderful to listen to Jacqueline, Kate, Flavia, and Lorenzo from around the world, but also bringing both very different perspectives. But at the same time, I think we intersect, there was a lot of common intersections as to, of course, the need for action, the thinking across scales, the systems thinking, the decentering completely from a kind of Western or European perspective. And I love Kate's, the old is new again, or should have always been new. And, all these, so it's almost like the process of this panel broke down the extreme bigness of climate and COVID into almost actionable pieces. And want to end on this notion of, turning it to Shannon. It was wonderful to bring in the voice and the questions of the students. I always feel like it is us who need to unlearn, and students who already know. And how do we unlearn and deconstruct our own disciplines and practices, and sort of realize that we are starting always in the wrong way, and we need to kind of turn things on their heads again. So thank you, Shannon, so much for bringing the crucial voice of students.
My pleasure. And thank you. I mean, I have truly enjoyed this engaging discussion about one of the most pressing concerns in the world today, the future of cities. It was a real joy to hear so many different perspectives. I wish we had more time. As I mentioned earlier, this is the first seminar of the Spring Global Columbia Collaboratory, the virtual exchange platform that's bringing students and thought leaders and educators from around the globe together to reflect, ideate, and collaborate to make an impact. We're looking forward to the remaining 2 future of collaboratory seminars this semester. So please keep an eye out for the announcement. Thanks again to all of our panelists joining us today: Kate, Jacqueline, Flavia, Flavia, Lorenzo, and in fact, a very special thank you to Lorenzo, since you've also agreed to teach a global core course on city diplomacy for our Columbia undergraduate program in Paris this summer. In fact, I encourage the undergrads joining us to consider exploring the topic further by taking the city diplomacy course that will be taught high flex, hybrid, and online from Paris. I want to also thank our amazing moderator, Dean Amale Andraos. Many thanks to you and just how you was really able to bring all the perspectives into the conversation. Many thanks to the team at Columbia Global Centers, Columbia World Projects, Columbia College, and the Center for Undergraduate Global Engagement. And of course, we want to extend a very special thank you to our amazing collaboratory students, partners, and participants from around the world. A reminder that a link to a recording of the full webinar will be sent to everyone who registered, and for others, you'll be able to find it on our website. Thank you and be well.
Thank you.